The wind in the Appalachian Mountains has a way of carrying whispers, the kind that slip between the trees and make even seasoned hunters glance over their shoulders. On certain nights, when the fog presses low against the valley, old-timers swear they can still hear the Harper cabin breathing. Not the living kind of breath, something heavier, slower, the kind that belongs to a place touched by darkness. Benjamin Harper built that cabin with his own hands, they say. A hunter so good he could read the forest like scripture, a man who moved through the pines as if they parted for him. To the folks in the nearby town, he was quiet, maybe a little strange, but harmless enough. A widower raising 3 daughters alone, doing the best he could in a world that rarely gives men like him much softness. But the daughters, they told a different story without speaking a word. You could see it in the way they avoided eye contact, how they flinched when Benjamin cleared his throat, how they lingered at the edges of gatherings as if afraid of being seen, or noticed missing. People chalked it up to shyness. Mountain kids were odd sometimes. No one wanted to imagine anything worse. As the years went on, the trail leading to the Harper cabin grew quieter. The girls stopped showing up in town altogether. And Benjamin, he began talking less and watching more, his eyes tracking every movement around him like he was hunting something no one else could see. Somewhere deep in those woods, a single flicker of truth waited, a truth that would make even the bravest men refuse to hike past sundown. Because once the Harper story finally broke open, the mountains were never the same again. And what happened in that cabin became a warning whispered to every child who dared wander too far into the trees. A reminder that sometimes, the real predators don't stalk the forests. Sometimes, they live inside the house. Benjamin Harper's reputation in the Appalachian Mountains was built long before whispers of darkness ever clung to his name. To the people who lived scattered across those rugged hills, he was the kind of man you respected because the land respected him. He understood the forest in a way that made others uneasy, not because he boasted about his skills, but because he never had to. He could track an animal across miles of unforgiving terrain, read a broken twig like a message, or disappear into the trees without stirring a single leaf. Hunters talked about him with a mixture of admiration and quiet envy, knowing he possessed an instinct that couldn't be learned, only born. For many, he was the man you called when livestock went missing or when a storm threatened to wash out the hunting trails, because Benjamin always knew how to navigate whatever the mountains threw at him. Yet beneath the surface of that rough respect was something else, something more complicated. People noticed the hard set of his jaw, the way he watched others with a cold, measuring stare. He wasn't cruel in public, nor openly hostile, but there was a sharpness to him that made conversations short and greetings stiff. Those who interacted with him often felt as if they were intruding on a mind constantly somewhere else, somewhere deeper in the woods than their eyes could ever reach. Still, in a place where solitude was common and oddness was simply a fact of mountain life, these impressions were shrugged away. Strange was normal in Appalachia, and Benjamin fit the kind of strangeness people knew how to ignore. His daughters, however, revealed a truth that outsiders didn't understand. When they stood beside him in town, they didn't carry the same quiet confidence he had. Instead, they lingered behind him like shadows, their shoulders drawn tight, their voices barely more than whispers. People assumed they were timid, the result of growing up far from other children, tucked into the wilderness where social graces weren't sharpened. But there were tiny signs that hinted at something else. The way they kept their hands close to their bodies, as if bracing for someone to grab them. The way their eyes darted toward their father before answering even the simplest question. The way they seemed eager to leave, eager to retreat back up the mountain as though safety waited only when the cabin door shut behind them. Still, no one questioned Benjamin. His skill, his solitude, and his silent demeanor blended seamlessly with the culture of the region. People didn't pry into another man's household, especially not one that sat miles deep in the woods where the lines between men and nature blurred into something primal, something that made outsiders think twice before asking the wrong kind of questions. The Harper cabin sat in one of those forgotten corners of the Appalachian Mountains where the world felt older, heavier, and untouched by anything resembling civilization. Reaching it required following a narrow dirt trail that twisted through thick pines and overgrown brush, the kind of path that looked different every time you walked it. Fallen branches, shifting soil, and dense fog could erase it within hours, making it clear that the forest decided who was allowed to pass. Most people from town avoided the area altogether, not because of superstition or rumored danger, but because there was simply no reason to wander that far unless you had a purpose, and very few had business with Benjamin Harper. His cabin stood miles past where the last fences ended, perched on a ridge that overlooked endless waves of darkened forest. Up there, sound behaved differently. Voices were swallowed by the trees, footsteps softened, and even the wind seemed to move with caution. If someone screamed from that cabin, it would die in the woods long before reaching another human ear. Isolation wasn't just a feature of the place, it was a design. Benjamin had chosen that spot himself, clearing the land with an axe and building the home plank by plank. The locals reasoned that a hunter like him would naturally seek solitude, a place where deer roamed freely and game trails were abundant. And for a while, that explanation was enough. But those who had seen the location up close sometimes felt a quiet discomfort settle in their stomachs. The way the trees leaned over the path like watching figures, the way the sunlight struggled to break through the canopy even in midday, the way the cabin seemed to sink into the landscape as if trying to hide from the world. It was the kind of place where a man could disappear in plain sight. Life for the Harper daughters in such an isolated spot was defined by the cabin's suffocating quiet. They had no neighbors, no schoolhouse, no children to play with. The forest served as their only world, and even that world was limited by their father's strict rules. Their lives revolved around silence, silence while doing chores, silence while fetching water, silence while walking the narrow path behind their father on rare trips to town. Isolation became both their cage and their normal, a barrier that cut them off from anyone who might have noticed their fear. Even the few who visited the area for hunting or trapping rarely passed close enough to see the cabin through the trees, and if they did, they never lingered. People respected Benjamin's privacy, convinced that isolation was simply a mountain man's way of life, never realizing that the distance between that cabin and the rest of the world was exactly what allowed the darker truths inside it to grow unseen. Benjamin Harper's shift in behavior began subtly, so subtly that no one in town noticed at first, and even his daughters couldn't pinpoint the exact moment when their father began to change. It started after their mother's disappearance, an event wrapped in silence and half-truths. Benjamin never offered an explanation beyond saying she had gone off on her own, a phrase that carried no emotion, no worry, and no invitation for further questions. In the mountains, people respected a man's privacy, especially regarding family matters, so no one pressed him for details. But inside the cabin, the atmosphere thickened as if the very walls absorbed the tension he carried. The daughters felt it long before they understood it. Something about their father's presence grew heavier, like a shadow that stretched further and darker each day. He became quieter, not in the calm, stoic way he had always been, but in a way that felt watchful and unpredictable. His eyes would linger too long, flickering with something that made the girls' stomachs twist. He moved through the cabin with restless steps, pacing at night when he thought they were asleep, muttering words that made no sense, as if arguing with someone who wasn't there. The men who once returned from hunting trips smelling of pine and smoke now came back with dirt smeared across his face and a distant look in his eyes, as though he had been chasing something invisible deep in the woods. Paranoia seeped into his routine. He triple-checked the locks on the cabin door, shoved heavy furniture against it during storms, and began forbidding the girls from stepping outside after dusk. He said the woods were changing, that something out there was watching, waiting. But the daughters soon realized it wasn't the forest he feared. It was everything beyond it, people, questions, the slightest possibility of someone discovering what was happening in the quiet spaces of their home. His rules became harsher, his voice sharper, and any slip in obedience brought a stiffness to his posture that made the air tremble. What troubled the girls most wasn't his anger but the unpredictability of his moods. One moment he would stare at the empty chair where their mother once sat, his eyes hollow, and the next he would erupt into frantic movement, tearing through drawers as though seeking something he had lost. Nights became the worst. The murmuring through the walls grew louder, the pacing more fevered, and sometimes the girls could hear him whispering their names in a tone that didn't sound like their father at all. They learned to sleep lightly, listening for footsteps, learning to anticipate the shift in his breathing that warned them he was awake again. Little by little, the men they once trusted unraveled before them, and the cabin that had always felt remote began to feel like a trap tightening around their lives. The discovery of the hidden room happened on a day that began like any other, with the same heavy silence hanging over the cabin and the same unspoken rules dictating every movement the daughters made. Their father had left before dawn for a hunting trip, disappearing into the woods with the ease of a man who knew every inch of the land. The girls rarely had moments without his looming presence, so the brief pockets of freedom felt fragile, like borrowed time. While cleaning the back hallway, the eldest daughter noticed something strange, a faint draft slipping through a thin crack along the wall near the floorboards. It wasn't unusual for mountain cabins to have imperfections, but this was different. The air that leaked through was colder, carrying a stillness that felt out of place. She pressed her hand against the wood and felt the vibration of emptiness behind it. Curiosity mingled with dread, but she couldn't ignore it. Over the next hour, she quietly pried at the baseboard, careful not to make noise that might echo through the cabin in case her father returned unexpectedly. The younger sisters watched, their eyes wide, exchanging nervous glances as the wood finally gave way with a muted snap. What lay behind it wasn't just a gap or a simple storage space. It was the edge of a concealed doorway, crudely covered but unmistakably intentional. The sight sent a ripple of unease through them. If Benjamin had hidden a door, he must have had a reason, and the girls knew instinctively it wasn't a harmless one. When they eased the door open, the darkness inside felt dense and unnatural, as though the small room had been sealed for years. The space was cramped, barely large enough for a grown man to stand, and the air carried a stale, metallic scent that made the girls step back. But what unsettled them most were the objects arranged with eerie precision on a small wooden table. Old traps, rusted tools, ropes coiled too neatly to be accidental, and a handful of their mother's belongings that should not have been there. A faded scarf, a cracked comb, a pair of shoes she had worn just days before she vanished. Seeing those items, tucked away like relics in a shrine, made their stomachs clench with a fear they had never felt before. As they searched further, they found a journal filled with symbols they couldn't interpret and short fragments of sentences written in a frantic hand. The pages revealed nothing clear, yet everything about them felt wrong. The discovery painted a picture none of them wanted to believe. Their father's growing paranoia, his whispering at night, the sudden disappearance of their mother, it all pointed toward something far darker than they had been willing to consider. The hidden room became a silent witness to a truth forming in their minds, a truth they desperately wished they could unsee. The strange incident on the hunting trip began on a cold morning when Benjamin announced he was taking only one daughter with him, choosing the middle child without explanation. His choices were never questioned aloud, but inside the girls, fear churned whenever he singled one of them out. She followed him quietly into the forest, clutching her worn coat tighter as they walked deeper than usual, far beyond the familiar trails. Benjamin moved quickly, almost too quickly, as if something unseen were urging him forward. He didn't speak, didn't check to make sure she kept up, and didn't behave like a father teaching his child the ways of the woods. Instead, he moved with a strange restlessness, his steps sharp and erratic, his eyes darting to shadows that held nothing but trees. As they reached a clearing, the girl noticed the silence had changed. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of the mountains but a suffocating stillness that made the back of her neck crawl. Benjamin stopped abruptly, staring at a spot between two massive oaks as though waiting for something to emerge. The girl tried to steady her breathing, unsure whether she should stand still or run. Without turning toward her, he raised his hand to silence her before she even spoke. Then, in a low voice that sounded unfamiliar, he whispered, "Do you hear it?" She listened, heart pounding, but there was nothing, no rustle, no echo, not even the usual chirping of distant birds. He gripped his rifle so tightly his knuckles whitened, and he slowly lifted the barrel toward the empty space between the trees. The girl watched as his body tensed, his breath shallow, as if preparing to shoot something only he could see. Panic shot through her when he stepped forward, his finger tightening on the trigger. She tried to speak, her voice trembling, telling him she heard nothing, saw nothing. For a moment, he turned his head slightly, revealing an expression she had never seen before. His eyes were wild, unfocused, as if he were looking through her instead of at her. Then, he took another step, this time toward her. The barrel of the rifle shifted in her direction, not intentionally at first, but enough to freeze her in place. She felt rooted to the ground, unable to breathe as he continued approaching, whispers spilling from his lips in a language she couldn't interpret. When he finally snapped out of his trance, it was abrupt, like waking from a nightmare. He blinked, lowered the rifle, and brushed past her without a word, acting as though nothing had happened at all. But she knew something had changed forever. In that clearing, under the pale morning light, she had seen a side of her father that no child should ever see. She realized he wasn't just losing himself to paranoia. He was becoming something unpredictable, something dangerous, something the forest itself seemed to fear. The whispers began as faint, almost imagined sounds that drifted through the cabin late at night, slipping between the wooden boards like cold drafts. At first, the daughters thought it was the wind moving across the mountains, stirring the trees in a way that made the world outside seem alive and listening. But the longer they lay awake, the more certain they became that the sounds weren't coming from the forest at all. They were coming from inside the house, from their father's room, spoken in a low, rhythmic cadence that made their skin prickle. The whispers were too deliberate to be wind, too quiet to be conversation, and far too unsettling to be dismissed. They grew sharper over time, stretching into long murmurs broken by sudden pauses, as though he were waiting for someone, or something, to answer. The sisters learned to distinguish the patterns of the whispers, the way his voice dropped into tones that didn't sound like his own. Sometimes he sounded angry, other times frightened, and occasionally heartbreakingly calm, as if speaking to someone he once loved. On those nights, the girls would squeeze closer together under their thin blankets, clinging to each other until the whispers faded into uneasy silence. In the daytime, Benjamin pretended nothing had happened, moving through the cabin with a stiffness that made the daughters question whether he even remembered the nocturnal conversations. But the hollow look in his eyes suggested he was losing the ability to separate day from night, reality from hallucination. The cabin walls, thin, aging, and warped from years of harsh mountain weather, did nothing to stop the sound from leaking into the girls' room. Sometimes they heard soft tapping between the whispers, as though fingers trailed along the wood, shifting from one place to another like someone pacing just behind the walls. Other times, the whispers swelled into frantic muttering, forcing the girls to cover their ears to block out words they didn't want to understand. What terrified them most were the nights when Benjamin spoke their names. He didn't call them, didn't shout for them, didn't ask them to come to him. He whispered their names slowly, stretching each syllable as though tasting the sound of them, repeating them over and over in a voice that felt foreign and predatory. They tried to convince themselves it was grief, madness, or exhaustion driving him to these strange behaviors. But there were moments when the whispers paused abruptly, followed by an eerie stillness so complete that the girls felt as if the entire cabin were holding its breath. Then came the soft creaking of floorboards, his footsteps moving with purpose toward their door before stopping just inches away. They would stare at the faint outline of his shadow beneath the doorframe, trembling as silence pressed heavily around them. Though he never opened the door in those moments, the threat lingered. The daughters knew the whispers were no longer just sounds in the night. They were warnings of how deeply their father was slipping away from sanity, and how little time they had before he slipped too far for any of them to survive. The first person outside the Harper cabin to sense something was terribly wrong was an old neighbor named Eli Turner, a man who had lived in the mountains long enough to recognize danger even when it hid behind polite silence. He didn't visit often, no one dared linger near Benjamin's property, but on the rare occasions their paths crossed, he always paid attention to the small details most people ignored. And the details around the Harper family were beginning to look darker each time he saw them. He remembered the daughters as quiet but timidly polite, always keeping their heads lowered and their hands clasped together. Lately, though, something sharper had crept into their expressions. Their eyes darted around as if searching for escape routes, their shoulders hunched as though bracing for impact, and their voices trembled even when answering the simplest questions. They looked like children living in constant anticipation of something they couldn't speak about. Eli noticed the bruises first, faint, barely visible beneath worn sleeves, but unmistakably the marks of fear rather than accidents. Mountain life was rough, and scraped skin or bruised arms weren't unusual, but these marks seemed different. They looked like the kind that came from someone being grabbed too hard, pulled too quickly, silenced too forcefully. And the girls seemed terrified of being touched, flinching away even when Eli simply raised a hand in greeting. Every instinct in him tightened at the sight, but Benjamin's cold stare warned him to keep his distance. Benjamin had always been strange, but now there was something else behind his eyes, something wild and territorial that made Eli's skin crawl. The cabin itself seemed to reflect the family's deterioration. On nights when Eli walked past the ridge, he heard strange crashes or low, frantic muttering drifting down through the trees, sounds he tried to convince himself were wildlife or the natural groans of an old structure. But deep down, he knew they weren't. He had heard human desperation before, the kind that happens behind closed doors, and none of what echoed from the Harper cabin sounded right. He considered intervening, but out in the mountains, interfering in another man's household was more than taboo, it was dangerous. And Benjamin had become unpredictable, quick to glare, quick to close himself off, and quick to send a message that no visitor was welcome. Still, Eli couldn't ignore the way the girls moved as though constantly shadowed by something they couldn't outrun. On one afternoon, he caught the eldest daughter glancing over her shoulder in raw, unguarded fear, her lip trembling before she forced herself back into silence. In that split second, Eli felt a deep certainty settle in his chest. Something inside the Harper home was unraveling, slipping past the edges of normal hardship and into a realm of quiet terror. And whatever it was, the girls were running out of time for someone to notice before it consumed them completely. The eldest daughter's attempt to escape came after months of tension that had coiled tighter with every passing day. Every whispered word, every glance from her father, every creak of the cabin's floorboards at night reminded her that the walls that had once been home had become a cage. She had been planning her escape quietly, memorizing the paths through the forest, noting the hours when her father left for hunting trips, and keeping track of the rare moments when the wind could cover her footsteps. Every decision she made was calculated, every movement rehearsed in her mind until it became second nature. She knew that leaving was dangerous, that one misstep could alert him and make the consequences far worse than confinement, but the fear that had built inside her demanded action. There was no other way to survive. On a moonless night, when the fog hugged the mountains like a living thing, she put her plan into motion. She waited until her father had settled into his nightly routine, pacing through the cabin with muttered words that no one else could understand. She crept silently past the rooms where her younger sisters slept, careful to avoid the loose floorboards that might betray her. The forest outside seemed to breathe, shadows twisting like unseen hands reaching toward her as she slipped past the threshold. Every step was measured, every sound accounted for, as though the forest itself had become both her ally and her judge. She had memorized the trail, but the darkness made familiar trees look alien, unfamiliar, and she forced herself not to panic, keeping her mind focused on one thing: freedom. But the mountains, for all their solitude, were never completely silent. The snap of a twig underfoot, the rustle of a branch against another, carried farther than she expected. Before she could gain real distance, a voice cut through the night, low, sharp, and filled with a presence that froze her blood. "Where do you think you're going?" Her father's voice had the weight of the mountains themselves, pressing down on her, and the cold realization hit that he had anticipated her move, as if he had been watching not just the cabin but her very thoughts. Panic surged, making her legs tremble, her heart hammer, yet she forced herself to move. The shadows of the trees seemed to close in, hiding her for a moment, giving her a fleeting hope that she might evade him. Benjamin appeared from the dark like a hunter emerging from the woods, swift and relentless. The distance between them collapsed in seconds, and her desperate attempt to escape became a struggle of wills. She realized that fleeing him would not be simple. The man she had once called father had become something else entirely, a force she could not outrun by strength alone. That night, in the cold fog of the Appalachian mountains, the balance between fear and hope shifted, marking the moment when innocence collided with the unrelenting reality of her father's dominance, and the forest itself seemed to hold its breath, watching the unfolding of a danger that had been quietly building for far too long. The storm hit the Appalachian ridge with little warning, turning the familiar forest paths into a maze of shadows and howling wind. Thunder rattled the mountains as sheets of rain hammered the cabin roof, and the night seemed to stretch longer than it should have. Inside, Benjamin Harper moved through the rooms with a restless energy that made the walls creak and groan as if they were straining under the weight of his presence. The daughters huddled together, listening to the storm outside and the unnatural rhythm of their father's pacing within, their hearts beating in time with the thunder. It was a night when the world felt unhinged, when the line between the ordinary and the monstrous blurred under the deluge of wind and rain. The cabin, once their shelter, now felt like a trap, each shadow stretching toward them with intent. Benjamin's agitation had reached a peak the girls had been anticipating with dread. Every whispered word, every sudden movement, every cold glance that had unsettled them for months now escalated into something tangible, something that could no longer be ignored. He spoke little, but his muttering carried through the walls in a cadence that seemed to echo the storm itself, rising and falling, punctuated by abrupt silences that made the daughters flinch. The fear that had been simmering inside them boiled over into urgent whispers between the sisters, their voices barely audible over the wind, as they debated their options. There was nowhere to go inside the cabin, and the forest beyond, soaked and treacherous, offered only a thin promise of safety. Lightning flashed across the sky, illuminating the cabin in stark bursts that revealed Benjamin's shadow moving across the walls in distorted, threatening angles. The eldest daughter realized that hesitation was as dangerous as action. The storm had erased the boundaries of sound and sight, giving her a fleeting chance to act while the world itself seemed to conceal her movements. She could hear the younger sisters' anxious breathing, their prayers whispered into the dark, and she knew that whatever happened next would define all of them. Every instinct screamed for them to flee, to use the chaos of the storm to escape the suffocating power their father held over them, yet every step carried the risk of discovery, the possibility of triggering his wrath in a moment when the forest itself seemed indifferent to human suffering. As the wind tore through the trees and lightning struck in jagged bursts, the daughters made a desperate choice, trusting instinct over reason, movement over paralysis. The storm became both a shield and a judge, masking their flight while intensifying every heartbeat, every nerve, every fear. It was a night that tested not just courage, but the fragile thread of survival itself, and in that relentless downpour, the Harper cabin transformed from a home into a crucible, where every decision had consequences that could not be undone, and the darkness of the mountains pressed in from every side, waiting to see who would endure and who would be consumed. The truth behind the Harper cabin finally came to light not through whispers or speculation, but because someone from the outside finally dared to venture close enough to see what had been hidden for so long. After days of silence, an uneasy neighbor named Eli Turner, guided by unease he could no longer suppress, decided to hike up the narrow, overgrown trail that led to the cabin. The fog clung to the mountains like a living shroud, and the air was thick with the scent of wet earth and decaying leaves. Each step carried the weight of dread, and the deeper he climbed, the more he felt the oppressive isolation of the ridge pressing down on him. The trail, familiar yet treacherous, wound past twisted roots and fallen branches, as if the forest itself were reluctant to let anyone approach the Harper home. Even at this distance, Eli could see the cabin looming ahead, dark and silent against the gray sky, and he sensed that what awaited him would change everything he thought he knew about the family who lived there. When he reached the cabin, the front door hung slightly ajar, creaking with the rhythm of the storm that had passed days before. The stillness inside was heavier than any sound he had expected, suffocating in its intensity. Furniture was overturned, floorboards bore scuff marks that told stories of desperate movement, and the air carried a metallic tang that made him instinctively cover his nose. As he stepped further inside, the evidence of long-hidden horrors began to reveal itself, personal belongings discarded carelessly, signs of struggle, and traces of objects stored away with unnerving precision. The room that had been discovered by the daughters months before now offered a grim confirmation of what had been suspected, hidden spaces that contained not only remnants of their mother's belongings but also tools and implements that made it impossible to ignore the sinister reality. Every detail screamed of control, of fear, and of a household trapped beneath the weight of its own secrets. The daughters themselves were found in varying states of shock, their eyes wide, their movements cautious, as if they were unsure whether the nightmare that had ruled their lives had finally ended or merely shifted form. Eli called for help, but in that moment, the forest seemed to hold its breath, the mountains absorbing the revelation before the wider world could arrive. When authorities finally reached the cabin, the magnitude of what had occurred became apparent. Benjamin Harper's actions had left marks not only on his daughters but on the very landscape of the ridge, shaping the air, the silence, and the memory of the mountains themselves. What was uncovered that day transformed the Harper story from rumor and fear into something undeniable, a grim testament to the darkness that can hide behind respectability and isolation, and a cautionary tale whispered through the Appalachian valleys for years to come.